Welcome back, everyone. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was almost over. Patton's Third Army had crossed the Rhine, driven deep into the heart of Germany, and was moving faster than anyone had thought possible just months before. Cities were falling. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. And everywhere Patton's soldiers went, they found something that none of their training had prepared them for. Not enemy soldiers, not resistance, children, German children, standing in the rubble of their cities, thin and hollow-eyed, holding out their hands to the men who had just destroyed everything they had ever known. And what happened next? What Patton said, what he ordered, what he did when he came face to face with the human cost of the war he had fought so hard to win. That story has never been told the way it deserves to be told. This is that story. To understand what Patton felt when he saw those children, you have to understand what Germany looked like in the spring of 1945. The country was not just militarily defeated, it was physically destroyed in a way that is almost impossible to describe if you weren't there. Cities that had stood for centuries were rubble. Supply chains that had fed a nation of 80 million people had completely collapsed. The Nazi government, which had diverted every available resource to the war machine for years, had left the civilian population with almost nothing. By early 1945, the average German civilian in many areas was surviving on less than 1,000 calories a day. Children were the worst affected. They had been born into the war. Some of them had never known anything else. And by the time American soldiers arrived, many of them were visibly malnourished, wearing clothes that were too small and too thin for the cold spring weather, living in basements and ruins because their homes no longer existed. American soldiers were not supposed to fraternize with German civilians. There was an official non-fraternization policy, firm, clear, and issued from the highest levels of Allied command. The reasoning was understandable. These were enemy civilians. The same population that had supported Hitler, that had cheered at Nuremberg, that had looked the other way while terrible things happened. The policy said, maintain distance, do not engage, do not share food, do not give gifts, do not have conversations beyond what military necessity requires. It was a policy designed to maintain discipline and to ensure that the defeated enemy understood the reality of their defeat. And then the soldiers actually arrived, and they met the children. There are accounts from dozens of veterans of the Third Army describing the same experience. You're moving through a destroyed German town. You stop for a rest, or to secure a building, or to wait for orders. And children appear. They come out of the ruins, or from around corners, or from the basements where their families are sheltering. They are small and thin, and their eyes are enormous. They don't speak English, and your soldiers don't speak German. But they hold out their hands, or they point to their mouths, or they simply stand there and look at you with an expression that no soldier, no matter how hardened, no matter how many months of combat he has seen, can look at without feeling something break open inside him. American soldiers started sharing their rations. Not because they were ordered to, because they were human beings, and the children were hungry, and the food was right there in their packs. They gave chocolate and crackers and canned goods and whatever else they had. They did it quietly, away from officers when they could, because they knew it violated regulations. They did it anyway. When this reached Patton's attention, and very little that happened in his army escaped Patton's attention, He was faced with a decision. He could enforce the non-fraternization policy strictly. He had the authority and the temperament to do exactly that. He could issue stern orders, impose penalties, make examples of soldiers who violated the rules. That would have been the correct military response by the book. He didn't do that. What Patton said, in various forms across multiple documented conversations and correspondence from this period, was essentially this: these are children. They did not start this war. They did not vote for Hitler. They did not build the camps or make the decisions that brought this destruction down on themselves and on Europe. They are hungry children, and my soldiers are going to feed them. He did not make a grand announcement. He did not issue a formal order reversing the non-fraternization policy. That was above his authority, and he knew it. What he did was look the other way. Deliberately, consciously, consistently. He made clear to his commanders, in the way that Patton always made things clear, directly, without ambiguity, in language that left no room for misunderstanding, that soldiers who gave food to hungry German children were not going to be punished. Not in his army, not on his watch. This decision reveals something about Patton that his public image, the hard-driving, slapping, cursing, aggressive warrior general, often obscures. Patton was a complicated man. He was capable of extraordinary harshness and extraordinary tenderness, sometimes within the same hour. He was the general who had slapped a shell-shocked soldier in a hospital tent in Sicily and nearly ended his career. He was also the general who wept openly when he visited a liberated concentration camp and saw what had been done there. He was the man who drove his soldiers harder than almost any commander in the war, who accepted casualties that other generals would have found unacceptable in pursuit of objectives he believed were worth the cost. And he was the man who, when he saw hungry children in the ruins of Germany, said, "Feed them." The soldiers of the Third Army did not need to be told twice. What had started as individual acts of quiet defiance, a chocolate bar passed through a basement window, a can of food left on a doorstep, became something more organized as Patton's implicit permission became known. Soldiers began pooling their rations. Units began identifying which areas had the most severe food shortages. In some cases, mess kitchens that were set up to feed American troops began quietly providing extra food that found its way to civilian populations, including children. There are stories from this period that stay with you. A sergeant from Ohio who learned 3 words of German so he could tell a group of children that the food was safe to eat. A tank crew that adopted, informally and unofficially, a group of children from a destroyed farmhouse near their position, and made sure those children ate every day for 3 weeks until the situation stabilized. A medic who gave his entire personal ration for a day to a family he found sheltering in a church basement because the youngest child was so weak she couldn't stand up. These are not the stories of war that get told in the big histories. They don't appear in the battle maps or the casualty figures or the operational summaries, but they happened thousands of times across the advance of an entire army. They happened. Because the men of the Third Army had a commander who understood something important, that winning a war and behaving with humanity are not mutually exclusive, that you can be the most aggressive